Christian parenting. I'm Julie Lyles-Carr. You're listening to the AllMomDoes podcast, part of the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Today on the AllMomDoes podcast, I'm your host, Julie Lyles-Carr. Heather Dixon is with me today. She has some profound things to share with us about what to do when you don't like your story. And you can't really change your story, which we don't like to hear sometimes. Heather, thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, hey, Julie, and hey, everyone who's listening and joining in with us. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So give my listeners a snapshot of where you live in the world, your family life, all of that.
So I live in a small town in North Carolina. It's called Knightdale. It's about 20 miles north of where I was born. So I haven't moved very far, but I love it. It's small town, Southern living, and it's the best. I am a wife to the most extroverted man on the planet.
No, I'm sorry. I'm a wife to the most extroverted man on the planet. We'll get that unpacked later. But okay, fine. For right now, he can wear the title. Go ahead.
There you go. There you go. And well, okay, let's just jointly absorb the introvert title together.
Let's do that together. Yes.
Lord bless. We balance each other, and that's good. And my son, we have one child. His name is Thomas, and he's not a child. He's like a man-child right now because he's eating us out of house and home. He is almost 14. He's a hockey player. And you really have not smelled anything at all until you have carried hockey equipment in your car all week long, back and forth to the rink. It's where I live, and I survive on good smelly spray things because it keeps my life happy.
Let me tell you, my brothers played soccer, and we were living in Southern California. And I have to say, there's a certain level where you think, oh, I've experienced what that can be. But hockey's a different lane, Heather, because all of the equipment, it's one thing to have shin guards and a jersey that you're like, whoa. But when I think about hockey, you're talking so much padding, so much equipment, all of that can just really absorb that man cub.
It is the man cub, and it's a testosterone hormonal puberty man cub right now.
Yeah.
And that is just, it's different altogether. When my husband and I met, he was playing hockey for college, and in his dorm room, he kept his hockey equipment underneath his bed. And it is a miracle that we actually stayed together just because of that. I mean, it's awful. You can't get the stink out of it. You just can't.
So for all those moms out there who have kids who are in all of those kinds of extracurricular activities, our heart goes out to you. Now, Heather, you and I have been getting to know each other over the last year or so. It's been such a blessing. We both have Bible studies that are out with the same publisher through Abingdon Women. And we got to have some time about a year ago at a mastermind retreat that was so exceptional. Mm-hmm. And just your personality, your joy for life, you just have this energy about you that's so amazing. You just captured my heart. And I was really floored as we got to know one another better that you have a whole health journey that to meet you and to spend time with you, if you had never told me, I might not have known. But it actually is an interesting category. There are people who have written about what are called invisible illnesses or invisible disabilities. One of my daughter has hearing loss, and if you don't see her hearing aids, you might not know it. And so you might not understand sometimes the level of fatigue, or if she's needing something repeated, or certain situations that are a little too much for her, you wouldn't know it because if you don't see the hearing aids, you don't know. You have something ticking within your own system that, again, to meet you, someone might know, but it's pretty profound. What is the health journey that you've been on?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that because for much of my life, I didn't know that I was carrying this genetic disorder. And, for the early part of my life, I lived a very healthy life. I was a fitness instructor. I taught people how to live well in their bodies. And I thought, I got this. I'm really good at this. I know my body. I know the feelings. I know when it's sick, when it's well. I mean, it was just my total jam. And then in the fall of 2015, I started to experience the slew of major medical events. And over the course of about 3 months, I had a miscarriage. I had a partial kidney infarction. And you try to tell your 8-year-old son that you have a kidney infarction, and like there'll be laughter forever.
Right.
He won't stop laughing. That word just doesn't go away. And then I had a ruptured carotid artery. And so my doctors were like, what is going on with your body? And so they were looking at my medical history, which had some other random major medical events in it that happened years past, like a ruptured colon. I had, let's see, my son was born prematurely. He was born 6 weeks early. And then they were looking at my mom's medical history. My mom died when she was 37. I was 11. And it was in 1988. So it was this really rare disorder. And so the doctors just chalked it up to a rare fluke. We didn't know. But she had died. She had a ruptured spleen. And so, like, if you're noticing this common word, going through, it's like rupture, right? So my doctors are looking at my history and they're looking at her history. And thankfully, when they wheeled me into the emergency room at the hospital when my carotid artery had ruptured, it was a European doctor. It's totally God in that story, because it's the disorder that I have is more prevalent in Europe. And so she was from Paris and she recognized it immediately. And she said, you know what, I'm going to fix you. And then when we're done, I want you to go get tested for this disorder. And so I did. And of course, it came back positive. And so the results were that, yes, I had a genetic connective tissue disorder called vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome has a lot of different types, and the vascular type is one of the more life-threatening types. What it does is it makes your blood vessels, arteries, and organs prone to spontaneous rupture. And I have seen most of the major medical events that are associated with this disorder. And so when we got the diagnosis, my husband and I talked to my doctor, and, we were sitting down with the geneticist. We said, great, what can we do? At this point, it was, January of 2016. Let's cure this.
Right.
We have medical advancements everywhere, right? Let's fix it. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes. He was very kind and very compassionate, but he softly smiled and he said, there is no cure or treatment. It is genetic. He said, what I can tell you is to prepare your bucket list and live your life well, because the average life expectancy of someone with your disorder is 48. So that was a tough pill to swallow, because we had never heard of it. And I had been, relatively healthy most of my life until kind of my 30s. And I had symptoms as a child, like I bruised easily. I would, I always called it a busted vein. I would get hit by a Nerf football and bust a vein in my leg. And, I was just that fragile, weird kid that sat out at PE all the time. But back then we just thought, just Heather, I mean, she was just whatever. That's just how our body's made. We had no idea that
Give the girl a hamburger. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. We had no idea that it was, more sinister. So that's kind of, the medical journey that I've been on. And that's the story that I carry, because it's, I live with it every day. And by looking at me, unless you notice my wonky eye, which is very lazy because I have so much metal behind my left eye, unless you notice that, you wouldn't see it. And so, so many of the women in my community, like, your family and women who may be listening, are walking through, when you carry an invisible disease, that's really hard, because people look at you like you're normal, and you actually have to make changes and choices that will care for your body and your wellness, your health and wellness that other people might not recognize the necessity to do so. So that's a bit of my journey.
Right. And that was something that was so incredible to me as you began to unpack the story, because you're not capricious about talking about this bucket list. And at the same time, there's also this realism of, you have been assigned something of a diagnosis forward, and yet you seem to be very philosophical about the fact that none of us have any guarantees about tomorrow. So how did you get to the place where that became both you not denying what some of the ramifications of this disease process can be, but at the same time, maybe not feeling quite as singled out, maybe also understanding that there are people who could have nothing genetically wrong whatsoever, and God calls them home at a time that most of us would say, that's not fair, that's too early. How did you work through all of that when it comes to your faith journey?
Sure. Well, let me be completely upfront and honest with you and your listeners and say that the 3 months after my diagnosis were very dark. I would be a liar if I sat here and said, "Oh, we got the call and I moved right on." Like, that's not how life works. I mean, that's not how we process anything. It was grief. It was a loss. It was mourning, expectations that I thought I had about my life. It was a period of fear and anxiety. I mean, during those 3 months, Julie, there were I was so anxious. I could go about 60 minutes before I felt the wave of a panic attack coming on because I was so afraid to move my body. Like I had just been told, your body is very fragile and is going to rupture at any time for any reason. And so I was afraid to move. And so, I would set an alarm on my phone to pray every 60 minutes because that was as long as I would last. And so I just stop what I was doing and turn on some worship music and pray. And I existed like that for about 3 months. I stayed in bed a lot. I am an Enneagram 4, wing 5, so I'm very prone to depressive moods and emotions and just, feeling really sulky and dark. And I allowed myself that time just to grieve and mourn these things that, that I thought, I'm going to grow old and I'm going to see my son graduate from college and see him get married. And maybe I will, Julie, but I might not. And so I had to kind of come to terms with those things. And, it was a long and slow process, but it was one where God, was so faithful in pointing me to places in his word. For example, one of the places I remember turning to that just, how God just kind of points you to certain scriptures and it keeps coming up in your daily, life. And this was one of those. I was like, okay, maybe I should pay attention to this. And it was, it was the end of Deuteronomy 30. And God basically tells the Israelites, I've given you two choices. I've presented before you blessings and curses, life and death, and, life with me, I am life. And he says, choose life. And it was just those two words just kind of just jumped off the pages for me. And I said, okay, God, I'm going to come to terms with this because here's the thing. Like, I'm not afraid to die. Mm-hmm. Like me personally, death is my servant because death ushers me into Jesus, into the presence of Jesus. What I was afraid of was leaving my loved ones and leaving, my husband, the extrovert. He needs me at home because he's lonely and, he wants to be around people. And, my son, I know what it's like to grow up without a parent. I really had trouble releasing his care into God's hands because I thought that's my job. Right? Those are the hardest things. But God just, he just patiently reminded me, you know what? I love your husband. I love your son. They are mine first. And I can take care of them far better than you can. And it wasn't, one day when I said, okay, God, here you go. I mean, this is a daily releasing. It's a daily laying it at God's feet and saying, God, I don't know what this day holds for me, but I trust you to take care of me and to take care of my husband and to take care of my son. And I think, the perspective that journey of just being allowed to grieve and working through scripture with God and spending time in prayer and just really taking time to process this hard story brought me to a place where I realized terminal is one of the words that's used to describe my disorder. Okay. Don't Google it. Because Google will terrify you of it. But, but if you do, you might find that word. And you know what, Julie, we're all terminal. We don't know how we're going home. Maybe I know how I'm going home, maybe not. But, none of us gets out of this earth alive. And so, and this is the way that God kind of blesses things, I mean, he turned this season into something very, very sweet for me because I'm very thankful for the time that I have. I'm sure you've walked through times and seasons where, they're hard, but you realize what matters and what doesn't, right? And so that's kind of a little bit of how I process that. And I'm still processing it.
Right. Because it's been now, 4 years since your diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So this is, still to some degree pretty fresh, Heather, in terms of the grappling with all of it and the thinking through the outcomes. One thing that I think a blessing that is from this season, having watched you in your ministry to women, is you have honed in on something that I feel like a lot of times we don't want to talk about as Bible teachers, as faith leaders, which is this concept that sometimes you do have to live a story that you don't like, that there's not a fix for it. And we tend to gravitate toward those people who tell us, you can change your story. You can change everything. You can change. And believe me, I think that mindset is important. I do think there are a lot of things that we live in and waller in that we really could change, and we choose not to change, or we're not equipped to change, or we need somebody to link arms with us, or we're going to have to do the hard work of getting up and picking up our mats. But there are elements of our stories that are beyond our ability to change. And when I have talked about you, about your ministry, about your writing, and this concept, I'm telling you, there are a lot of women out there who are like, tell me more, because that's where I'm living. I'm not living in a place where just getting into an exercise class or cutting out the carbs is going to fix everything. Right. So talk to me about what you have learned in the midst of a story that you can't change. And how have you combated to some degree wanting to try to create change that's not there, and at the same time accepting the responsibility to change the things you can within the confines of a story that you may not want to live?
Sure. So I think one of the things that has been most important is that I gave myself permission to grieve. And I think this is something that we as women, as believers, we kind of skip over, because there's a desire to say, God is good, the end of story, and so he's going to take care of us. And, somewhere along the way, we've accepted that grief is a lack of faith. And, I don't think that that's true. Even, Jesus grieves, right? He knows that, when Lazarus dies and Mary and Martha call him, and he dies when Jesus is on the way, and he knows he's about to raise him from the dead, but he stops and he weeps for his friend, because he understands that, the brokenness of this world is an expression of the need for our Savior. And so, I think we have kind of forgotten how to lament, and that lament and grief is okay, because it's an acknowledgement that, look, we're not living in a perfect world. We're not living in the end of the story. We're living in the meantime, where things are still broken and hard and hurting. And yes, God is sweet and good along the way, but this is hard stuff. And so I think, giving myself permission to grieve, to say, you know what, God, I don't like this story. I'm not okay with this. And eventually I'm going to trust you with this. But right now, no. Why me? Am I being punished? That's another thing. Are we tempted to believe that we are walking these hard stories because we're being punished? And, it's really hard to say Romans 8:28 and, that God is working for your good always, and to believe that for yourself when you are carrying a story that you don't like. That's really, really hard to do. And so I think we have to give ourselves permission to grieve. We have to give ourselves, the permission to be honest and authentic with God and with those who know and love us the most. And to say, you know what, so many times I've told my husband, I'm not okay with this. I'm going to need some space here. That I need time to process this. Don't give me the, hey, back up and, pull your big girl panties on and move on. I'm not ready for that. And that's okay. And then I think the flip side of that, Julie, is, taking baby steps and assessing what you can change in your story. So, for example, anxiety is a huge issue for me. And I have this large toolbox of things that I use to battle anxiety. And I'll be the first one to admit that one of the things in that toolbox is medicine. That's something that I can change, and I talk to my doctor. I've walked through seasons where I've needed it and seasons where I haven't. And this current season that I'm in is a season that I needed. And so, the process of asking help is also not a lack of faith. It's taking a baby step and realizing that we have free will to take control over the things that can help us. while we wait for God to work on the things that we can't change. And so, I work on that toolbox. I take my anxiety medicine. I balance my schedule so I'm not overwhelmed. I take a lot of time for soul care and rest. I truly believe rest is worship. And so, I prioritize things that our busy culture doesn't recognize as productive, because that helps me. And so I'm taking these baby steps of controlling the things that I can to help me live my heart story. And then, you work on building faith and trusting God for the things that you can't. And that's, not always easy, but it is possible. And I think that's the journey of walking with Jesus in these stories that we just, we don't want, we don't like.
Heather, have you found that there have been some people in your world who, as your hard story became more fleshed out, if you will, as the diagnosis came, the ramifications of that diagnosis, all of those things, did you have people who retreated from you a little bit, that they just couldn't quite handle living in a space and walking alongside someone who had a hard story that didn't appear to be changing?
Yes, I would categorize the people in three different ways. Number one, I had people who did exactly what you said. It's too much to carry. I think we probably find this anytime, we know someone who has lost a loved one. You don't know what to say, you don't know what to do. And there's a season of it where, you're grieving and then you can step back in. Well, this is constant for me. So, I think, yes, certainly there were people who, stepped away just because they just didn't know how to handle it. And their intentions are good, but there's no manual for this. There's no one saying, oh, your loved one or your friend has this really, really hard story and they don't know what to do. And they don't, so like the reaction is they just step away. So yes, certainly. I also had people in my life that wanted to kind of attach to the drama of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yes. And I was not okay with that.
Had not thought about that, but yeah.
So people that just wanted to piggyback on riding the drama, and that, makes me really uncomfortable. And so for those situations, I just had to set boundaries and say, you know what, this is not your story. Right. This is mine, and I'm not going to freak out about this. It's a choice that I made. I had to set boundaries in terms of how much I shared, how honest and authentic I was, just because I just felt like, people rally around drama and excitement and anything other than the ordinary. And not that my story is dramatic, but it just, there was a lot of big moments in it. And so, I really, for my own health and well-being, I had to set boundaries with that type of reaction. And then the third is a beautiful one, is where, I have, a few very select dear friends who just sit with it with me. They sit in the story with me, and they have no expectations on how I respond or how I react or how I process it. They're just committed to be there with me. And that is the most beautiful type of friendship and support that you can give to someone who's walking with a hard story.
Wow. Incredible. Those three categories of friends. And I think there are places in Scripture where we see examples of those three kinds of friendships and what they mean in walking something out that's a challenge. As a mom, how have you handled this with your son? A lot of us, in wanting to be protective of our kids, will skip sometimes talking about the hard stories or the hard things that we're going through. And yet this is one that, of course, to not talk with him about could leave him unprepared. And we pray that's not the case ultimately. But how have you taken on the responsibility of sharing this hard story with him at tender ages, because he was young when this began? So what has that been like as a mom, guiding and leading him through this story?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that is so tender to me. So when my colon ruptured, he was 4. And that came out of the blue. It was a 6-7 month process. My colon ruptured, and then I had to temporary ileostomy and had to go back in for them to reverse that. And it was just a long recovery process for me. And he saw that. And I think, we saw him respond in ways that a 4-year-old could not articulate. But he became, a little bit more attached, like a tangible example. I mean, obviously, kids are attached to their moms. And he's a mama's boy, so we're attached to the hip still anyway. But, one of the ways that we saw it was at nighttime. He was afraid to go to bed by himself. So I acknowledged that. I mean, I said, okay, I'm going to do this. I mean, I'm okay with that. And if this is a way that brings him peace and comfort to have me there, we kind of eased him through that season of anxiety just by providing steadiness and comfort and presence. Because I think he was afraid, every time I go into the hospital, I disappear and I'm in the hospital and he has to deal with these things. And that was hard for him. And so one of the ways that we initially responded to that was just by physical presence and comfort and assurance. He was 8 when I had a miscarriage and my carotid artery ruptured. And that was a really difficult time for him. He was in 3rd grade and he just had, everybody taking him to school. And so we started to be, a little bit more open and honest at that. That was the point when I got my diagnosis. But we told him, mommy's body is fragile, but we didn't tell him the full ramifications of it because we just didn't think that he was old enough to process mom might die from this. We, in ways that would support him, we did extra family time. We do spontaneous vacations. We really value and prioritize making memories together in a way that we had not done before. I mean, sure, we did vacations before, but now we really prioritize family. It's just the 3 of us, which is, a completely different dynamic than your family, with all your blessed children. But, we're really, really close in that way. And so we tried to give him memories. We prioritized giving him memories. And then when he was about 12 years old, we were honest with him. And part of that was twofold. Number one, we felt like being transparent at a time when he could handle it was the best. Thomas is very perceptive and he knows when we're being honest and when we're not and when we're withholding information. And we just felt like being straightforward and honest was a way to process that with him. And 2, he was traveling with us when I was speaking and we were doing these events and I was sharing my story and he was hearing it. And so, I wanted him to not feel like he was not being told everything. And, Julie, we found that in doing that and, sharing with him the honest part of it has allowed him a safe place to process it with both me and my husband together.
Right.
Instead of, when this happens, it'll be a total surprise. And now mom's gone. I mean, that's a reality that we have to prepare for. But we wanted to give him a safe place to process it while I was still here, to ask me questions, to go through things. What happens when? What happens? How do I handle this? And so, honesty is our best policy. Certainly there was a time when we shielded him from that and we, didn't allow him that information. But now we're completely open and straightforward. He knows my entire medical history. He knows all the ramifications for it. And it's kind of become a way to talk about the gospel with him. And I think that anyone who carries a hard story understands this, that when you carry hard, unchangeable stories, it is the gospel story made manifest. It is the story that there is no cure for us except for Jesus. And in a way, it's a privilege to be able to share that and talk about my story with him in that framework. Because he has a deeper understanding of what Jesus does for us eternally. So yes, we certainly have kind of transitioned our honesty and our upfrontness with him over time. But now we find, he's almost 14 and he understands, that this is the truth. And we deal with it together as family.
Right. I love the way you lay out that progression and how you have honored both the ages and stages he's in and knowing his personality and what he can handle, and at the same time coming all the way to a full disclosure to him. I think that's really a powerful thing. Heather, what do you do? Because we have people who are very well-meaning. You talk about your hard story. I've had places where I've spoken about my daughter Mercy, who had a stroke at birth and has left side hemiplegia. And we talk about the things that we've learned in those circumstances. We share that. We think it's important to do that. And then every now and then you will have, or I will have, someone who is well-meaning, but there'll be that email that comes after you or I speak, and it'll say something along the lines of, I really want to encourage you to pray for healing. If your faith was big enough, this would be taken care of. Heather, your medical condition would be resolved. Julie, your daughter's stroke would be eliminated. Things would be just click back to normal, and this story would be done. How do you handle that when you have those people who you know are well-meaning? They're trying to, in their way, be encouraging or spur you to greater faith. But that moment where you go, yeah, gee, it's never dawned on me to pray to be healed. How do you handle that? And at the same time, leave room open for God to do miraculous things. I don't want to in any way say that he won't, but sure. How do you juggle all of that? Because I find that to be challenging. I'm just going to be upfront and say those are moments that are hard for me to be gracious. How do you do it?
So I'll tell you, my fleshly response wants to use, and don't do this, but my immediate fleshly response wants to use the Bible as a weapon. Yeah. And I want to point them to the book of Job and be like, this is exactly the advice that Job's friends gave him, and it was wrong. Yeah. That's wrong advice. That's wrong advice. I don't do that. So I want to, though. I think that, number one, I have to have confidence and assurance in my own faith journey. And what I mean by that is there was a season in my life when I do think it was a very dark season of my life after my dad died. And my dad died suddenly when I was 31. And he had a car accident, he hit a tree, and I was not expecting it. And I did not handle it well. And I turned away from God. I turned away from my faith. And those 4 years were the darkest 4 years of my life, even darker than processing this medical diagnosis. And so I think, I have the benefit, and this is, for those of us that walk along in our faith and walk with Jesus, we know that it's not picket fences and rainbows, and it's not a straight line. It's hills and valleys and, mountains, it's mountain peaks and the trenches. And I have the benefit of looking at that season of my life and looking at this season of my life. And if you're doing, flat logic and comparison, you can't make the conclusion that God is punishing me because my faith was weak or strong, or that God does things because my faith is weak or strong. Because the season where after my dad died, it was very dark. And that, in large part was because I turned away from God. But then this season with this medical diagnosis, was also dark, but my faith was really strong when that happened. I mean, I was up and I am up in the morning every day reading the Bible. Before my family gets up, I cling so tightly to him. So, I have to have confidence and know, number one, no, my faith is really strong. I do trust Jesus. I do trust God. And so realizing that what someone else says about your faith does not also mean the truth. Right? Mm-hmm. Another person doesn't get the privilege of determining the strength of my faith. That's God's job. That's not their job. And then I think the second step to that would be give them grace. That's the Sunday school Jesus answer that we're expected to say and not use the Bible as a weapon. And understand, their intentions are good. The motivation behind that comment, hopefully, and maybe it is, but hopefully is not to judge or to criticize, but to bring you to a place of healing and peace. I tend to have a template response. I'll be honest with you, I have a canned response that it's very gracious, but I have it saved in my Google Notes, along with anyone who tries to send me supplements and nutritional supplies and things that will help cure my body. I have a very gracious response that just says, thank you so much for thinking of me in this way. I appreciate your concern. I know and I trust that God can heal me, but for this season, he has chosen not to. So I will cling to him along the way. And then I just end it. So, we're all walking through hard stories, Julie, and they're sharing that because they've had a positive experience with their faith. And that's good. But, separate the boundaries and remember that's not, they don't get to determine the strength of my faith, and I don't have to listen to them also.
Right. Graciously.
Yeah.
And what a gracious way to handle that. I just love that. Heather, you have so much class, so much sass, and so much light in you. Heather Dixon, Renewed is the Bible study for listeners who find themselves thinking, I'm not loving the story that I am living. How do I manage it? The subtitle is Finding Hope When You Don't Like Your Story. Heather Dixon, thank you so much for being with me today. What an incredible blessing you are. And honestly, I know this isn't the story you intended, but wow, what a beautiful story. Thank you for being willing to share it.
Thanks, Julie.
You'll find more from this episode on the show notes. Be sure and check them out at allmomdoes.com. And wanted to ask you a big favor. Be sure and go to wherever you are listening to this podcast and give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us get the word out about the podcast. Can't wait to see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.